Thank you, everyone. Maybe you're here because you have read some of her works, in which case you're probably going to start laughing at any minute because you know she's funny. And if not, then you're going to be in for a treat hearing about this one, this book of essays, Maybe It's Me on Being the Wrong Kind of Woman. And it's an exploration. It really is almost archaeological, I think, in a way. So I was hoping she'd show up in a pith helmet, but you'll have to settle for my hat, absent that. So thank you for being here. It's such a treat because I'd read your book before COVID and then they canceled this, so I'm glad that we are back together in the same room.
Well, I'm thrilled to be here. This is just such an amazing literary festival and such an amazing place. I'd never been here before. And thank all of you for coming. I know it's the end of the festival. I'm up against Dave Barry, who's funnier, and David Duchovny, who's better looking. But I really appreciate your coming. And I feel like I should be the one interviewing Pat. She's the celebrity. But
no.
anyway, I'm thrilled to be
Not if you change the channel. Change the channel, that's what it's for. So, all right, so let's begin with the title. What is the right kind of woman?
Well, so of course it's kind of a facetious title.
Yeah.
You know, once you say maybe it's me, you know the person's thinking, I don't think it's me, you know. But I think it's a feeling a lot of us have where, you know, is it just me or is the whole world crazy? But there was, as I think as all of us were growing up, there was a sense of what it meant to be the right kind of little girl, daughter, woman. And I just, from the earliest age, I could sense that I was not what I was expected to be. I was messy. You know, my mother would dress me up in these fancy, uncomfortable clothes that I hated, and I'd come back with them all ripped and torn and stained. And I was always being told that I wasn't the right kind of little girl. And then, so I wrote all these essays separately. They were not written as a book. They were written over many years. But when I went to put them together as a book, I was trying to find what the common thread was. And I just thought at every different stage, I didn't feel like the right kind of little girl, daughter, wife, mother, writer, Jewish woman, so many things. And so I was really, I think, looking at that the whole time.
Well, nowadays you would have your own sitcom by age 12, I think, because they'd say, we want that kind of girl. But so many of us, I think women feel like we're rowing upstream when we are stepping out of any of those kind of boundaries. And in this, you write about so many of the strictures. You're a woman in science. You know, you're a Jewish woman who had a lot of questions about Jewishness and your own religious identity. A daughter who, you know, was trying to fit in within the family, never mind the larger human family. And even as a student, you had, what I loved about these essays is that when you have a sense that you're kind of watching yourself as things happen to you, that there's a sense of you as the creator or the producer, and you're standing back from these events and kind of folding your arms, you know, like Orson Welles out there trying to get a bead on what your life is like. Did you feel that way while you were living it, that you had that sense of observing outside yourself?
I think I did. First of all, I remember so much of my life, of my early years. I can't remember. If you told me a 3-digit number now and then waited 2 seconds, I wouldn't remember the 3-digit number. But I remember what, you know, happened to me in first grade and who was wearing what and who said what. So I must have been observing. But, and I like to say I invented the memoir because I remember I was about 11 years old and I was writing stories and things. And I said to my sister, I had a great idea. I'm going to write a book about what I think about everything, what it's like to be me every day. She said, who would want to read that? You know, which, you know, it is pretty egotistical, but so I think I was analyzing everything as I was living it. But I was also, when you're being criticized all the time, there's that in the first essay where the teacher said, Eileen, has anybody ever told you you're obnoxious, right? You think, well, first of all, I thought it was a wonderful word, obnoxious, you know. But you think, am I not? What is that? You know, so you're put in a position where you have to be questioning yourself. And, you know, so I also have to say it's, you know, I did well in school. I was smart. And even now to say that, if you're a woman, right, isn't it shocking to hear a woman say, I'm smart? First of all, it sounds really egotistical. but it's the one thing you're not supposed to say if you're a woman. You can say I had an eating disorder, or I have this mental problem, I did, when
A
I
shoe
first got my
addiction.
period. You can say any, really touchy, sensitive, thing, and people are like, oh, that's cool, we can say those things now. But that's the one thing you're not supposed to be or say you are or take pride in. And so I thought if I got good grades, if I did well, if I questioned things, that I would earn, people would think I was really special, and the men would think I was really special and I would get somewhere. And it's the exact opposite. And so, when you're doing something that you think is going to get one result and it gets another result, you think, what am I doing wrong?
Well, I mean, you grew up in the Catskills, so you may come by your humor just from the air around you. But I think that when people say to women, what are you looking for in a man? You look for kindness and a sense of humor. I don't think I've ever heard a man say, I'm looking for a sense of humor in a woman, because we're supposed to be the audience, right?
Well, so one of the title essay, and there maybe it's me, is about dating in Manhattan in my 60s. And every single man in New York says, I'm looking for a woman with a good sense of humor.
Oh.
And I thought, I grew up at a hotel in the Borscht Belt. I have done stand-up comedy. I have a great sense of humor. And it really took me a long time to figure out that they meant they wanted someone who would laugh at their jokes. And not that they wanted me to be funny. And I just think, I was literally in my 60s before I figured that out.
Well, you got a BA in physics at Yale, and as we've learned from watching The Big Bang Theory, of course, women in science are hilarious, right?
Don't get me started on The Big Bang Theory. In one way, it's a good show because it makes science seem kind of fun. I don't know. One
Accessible?
problem we have in this country is that nobody, male or female, who's native-born American wants to be a scientist because you're nerdy. So in 7th grade, 8th grade, the way to be unpopular is to be good in your science and math class. It's especially true for girls. So the sort of nerds on that show, are lovable. But, when it started out, there were no women on The Big Bang Theory. And then they put Bernadette and Amy, they put them in. But those are not women you would want to be. I don't know if you've watched the show, but Sheldon's girlfriend, eventual wife, who wants to grow up to be her, right? She's dowdy, she's strange. In real life, though, the woman who plays her is lovely, and she is she has a science degree. She's very attractive, she's very charming, but they had to make her a woman scientist. They had to make her almost a monster. I mean, she's lovable in her own way, but she's very strange.
Let's put it this way, she wouldn't need much for her Halloween costume.
Right.
Okay.
And who do you want to be on that show? You want to be the girl next door, Penny, right? Who's blonde and pretty and has cleavage, and that's who not Sheldon. That's who who marries her. What's his name?
Leonard.
Leonard marries her.
Thank you.
She is literally math illiterate, and that's her charm, right? So that show is not the favorite show of most women scientists.
In reading about your evolution into who you are, there were glimmers of that distance that we spoke about, and also that sense of the scientific observation when you were talking to the school psychologist and you were suspicious when he offered you Oreos. So that gives us a sense of you. Describe that incident. I thought that was very revealing.
Well, so when I was in 3rd grade, I got in trouble a lot because I was very bored. And if you got in trouble, you couldn't work in the workbooks that were for the kids who could do advanced work. So the more bored I was, the more I acted out, and the less I was able to work in, learn multiplication and division or whatever. So I got sent to the school psychologist, and he was a very strange man. It was the 1960s. He had this huge bushy head of curls. He was wearing a white suit with red little lines on it. I said he looked like the boxes that popcorn came in, and he had a bow tie. And I had never seen a man in a bow tie.
Were you tempted to snap it?
Well, I thought he was a clown. And and he had that, I don't know if you know what Gene Shalit looks like, or with the glasses and the nose and the mustache that look like they're all attached. Very strange man. He's giving me all these tests and he's saying strange things to me. And then he offers me some cookies. And I had been taught you're not supposed to take food from strangers because they might poison you. And I didn't trust the guy. So I said, how do I know you're not trying to poison me? So that did not help. That did not really. And then,
especially the psychologist.
Right.
Like,
well, then what happened next? So it's the first essay in the book. A pigeon flew in the room. And the pigeon was flying around, and the man was so upset about the pigeon, the school psychologist got up on his desk and was like batting away the pigeon. So imagine you're in third grade, and you're sitting there, and there's this grown man in this strange costume flailing around because there's a pigeon in the room. And he thought I was strange. He sat down and he said, "Didn't you see there was a pigeon in the room? Weren't you upset?" And I said, "Why should I be upset? It's not my office. I don't have to clean up after the bird, you know." So why was I the strange one? You know, I was always trying to figure things out.
And so this sense comes through the book of you observing yourself, observing other people. And one thing that I mean, there were so many poignant moments in here that were bitter and sweet. And one of them had to do with the cleaning woman that your family hired, who had such a sad ending. But at one point, she was mesmerized by the idea of writing and watching you. And maybe it's a writerly anecdote, but I think it's a very touching anecdote about how people observe other people.
Yeah, so we had this lovely woman who came in. She had been orphaned young, and all the ladies, and I said it was like a Eudora Welty novel, so that everybody hired her and treated her nicely. But then she married a no-goodnik, as my mother would have called him, and had a daughter who she idolized, so Helen couldn't read and write, but her daughter was quite bright. But then the daughter started mistreating the mother, and everybody turned against the daughter. And then the mother met a sorry end. A lot of what I'm doing in the book is not so much that I was analyzing things at the time, although I think I was, but one thing I love about writing is looking back on your life and reinterpreting what what did you think at the time? What do you think now? Can you do some research and find out what was really going on?
That's the archaeology, yes.
Yeah, and everybody so condemned this little girl, blamed her mother. It became obvious to me as I was writing the essay that she was being sexually abused by the father. They both, like what little girl just turns on her mother, and that they were sleeping in the same bed. And I think all the women in the neighborhood knew, but sort of blamed the little girl for somehow seducing her father away from her mother. And I was just like, didn't anybody think about the little girl? You know, it just, I think especially now all the social movements we've been through, Me Too, and, thinking about race in different terms. I should say this whole family was white. But in other places in the book, and in the book I'm writing now, looking back on racial aspects of the town, it's amazing what we thought then versus looking back how we see the same events now. Very different. So what happened was I had taken my first writing course. I guess I was a freshman in I had taken my first writing course, and I was home for vacation, and I was typing up that week's assignment, and Helen was standing in the doorway, and she said, "Can I ask you a question?" And I said, "Of course." She said, "When most people type, they're looking at something and typing what they see. You're just looking into thin air. What are you writing?" And I said, "I'm making up a story." And she went, "Oh, that's where stories come from? People just make them up?" And I said, "Yeah." And, that was amazing for her, but it suddenly, I think it made me really want to switch from physics to writing, although I loved physics too. Yeah, I'm making it up out of thin air, You can do that. which is really the joy of writing.
I've had this argument, discussion with friends in the sciences about how important it is that they be able to write and speak about what they do, because science can deliberately or inadvertently close itself off
Right.
from everybody, and it's like, oh, it's too complicated, I can't explain it
Yeah.
to you. Whereas they depend on public funding in a lot of cases, and science makes the world go round. You're all using your cell phones to figure out how to get here and what you want to see and do, and how to maybe have a smart house. You're running your house from your phone. So are you a proselytizer for telling other scientists, you got to get on board with this?
Well, I should say first that the kind of physicist I was a theoretical physicist. I was terrible in the lab. I mean, if I could break it or electrocute myself, I did, I did that. But if it was just the imagination, if you were imagining, what the electrons were doing, or space and time and multiple dimensions, that was what I was good at, and I loved, because it's just the imagination, right? But in terms of writing about it, it's really very hard. And, I really admire people who are good at it, and most scientists are terrible at it. I taught for many years at the University of Michigan, and I was with with the writers and the humanities people over in the English department, but a lot of my friends were scientists. And when they discovered the Higgs boson, you remember the God particle, everybody was so excited. So the physics department said, we're going to have a lecture and tell people so they can understand what the Higgs boson was. So everybody I knew from the humanities, all the poets, the fiction writers, everybody went over to hear this explanation. We're sitting there for hours, and all these different scientists get up, and I have a physics degree. I didn't understand a word anybody was saying.
Wow.
At one point, they put a picture up of the graduate students who had been working on this thing in Switzerland at CERN. That was the only thing I understood. And I have a physics degree. And then one guy goes, there's a metaphor you'll all hear about how how when the Higgs boson, goes through the through space, it sort of is like when something goes through molasses or maple syrup, and then it leaves a trail, and everybody goes, yes, oh, I understand that. And he said, that's not true. Don't link it. So this goes on for hours. And finally, I just thought, this is screwed up, because I haven't understood anything, and so I know that none of these people understand it. And I got up and walked out. Well, all the rows around me, she's leaving. I'm out of here. If Eileen doesn't understand it, I don't have to keep pretending. But, that book oh God, I know this is a senior moment. The book about time that
Stephen Hawking?
That Stephen Hawking did. I understood that one, but it really was not. Everybody bought that. That was the bestseller. Nobody understood that book.
You
but
just
there
had
are
to have
people
it there to show that you.
There are people who are very good. Brian Greene is very good.
Neil deGrasse Tyson is very good.
And you know what's wonderful? So all the science writers used to be men, but now there are more women in the sciences, but they reach a point where they don't want to go on for their PhD, or they get their PhD and they don't want to spend their life in research, because now they've realized A, how hard it is to get a grant, and B, how difficult it is for women, to really progress. And so a lot of them have become science writers, and almost all the science writers now are women, and they are doing a much better job of actually conveying what's going on in more understandable terms.
And there are a few. I was telling Eileen that a friend of mine, a woman, won the Nobel Prize in physics or in chemistry about 3 years ago. And one of the things she does so well, and I think it may generate some resentment, is that she can explain what it is that she does in a very compelling way, and so people know the processes. And I expect there's some jealousy about that too. But my other proud moment in science was when I was talking to Stephen Hawking at an event, and he said something through his voice translator to his friend, and I said, what did he say? And the guy said, he's flirting with you. So you think you know what's going on my tombstone?
I'm going to touch you because you touched Stephen Hawking.
I mentioned the word archaeology, and there are a couple of essays in this book that are you kind of re-exploring the childhood and comparing your memories and perceptions to now. And one of them, I mean, it was a really investigative journalism kind of thing called the Jewish Shah. So can you tell everybody briefly what the Jewish Shah story is? It's so charming
Sure.
and plausible enough just to keep you thinking, well, this could be.
So we all have family stories, right? And you hear these stories, and they're very vague. You don't quite know if they true or not, whatever. So my family's story was that the Shah of Iran was Jewish. Okay, so the Shah that the father of the Shah who was deposed, right, during the Iranian Revolution, that he was born in Russia, and he and his brothers were going to be conscripted into the Tsar's army. So most of the brothers lit out for America, but he did something different. He went east over the Caucasus Mountains, ended up in Iran, and worked his way up through. The story was he was in a brigade of Cossacks, which piqued my interest because I thought, what were Cossacks doing in Iran, and how would a bunch of Jews make that up, right? Like, this is not a detail that would just come to you, right? And that he rose, there was a revolution, he converted to Islam, and he made himself over he became the Shah of Iran. And my father...
The father of the Shah who got
right,
deposed.
the father of the Shah who got deposed. Now, how did my father know this? He went to dental school. My name's Pollack. He went to dental school with somebody named Sidney Pahlavi. They did everything together. Then they were in the war together. They were in India for 4 years during the war. And Sidney said, let's go visit my relative, the Shah of Iran. My father, what do you mean, And Sidney told him this story and said, he's my first cousin. And my father was sure that anybody, if the Shah, who was still in power, who was his son, knew this, they would send the Savak to wipe us all out.
Right, or your father's friend was taking too much laughing gas, right?
Well, my father totally believed it. And what was the clincher is he looked exactly like the Shah. It was spitting image. So I grew up hearing this story. My brother thought it was crazy. I had a research grant. I researched it. And I'm absolutely convinced it's true. But more than that, it led me to understand a lot more about my father, about his time in India, about his friendship with this guy, Sidney Pahlavi, who died young. I ended up meeting his daughter, who didn't know her father. So, and if you think about it, if the story's true, then the Shah, who was deposed, didn't really know his father, because his father was Jewish. So it became not only an essay about the Shah of Iran and whether he was or wasn't Jewish, but what we do or don't really know about our parents. I'm very interested in what parents don't know about their children and what children think they know and don't really know about their parents. So that's more where it went from there. But I'm also really interested in family stories. When I was in graduate school, my teacher was a wonderful African-American writer named James Allen McPherson, who had taught in Charlottesville at University of Virginia. He was very knowledgeable about Thomas Jefferson, and he told me that Jefferson had fathered all these black children with Sally Hemings. This was before it was proved and where everybody thought it was nonsense. And he said, no, it's true. Family stories tend to be true. And so I'm just really interested in these stories that come down through the generations. Here's another one. I always heard that the boat my grandmother took to America sank before she got on it. And that makes no sense, does it? If it sank before she came over, how'd she come over on it? But you can look up anything on the internet now, and that's in there too. I figured out what happened. It was it was called the Miracle Boat. It got lost in a hurricane. This is the trip it made before it brought my grandmother over. It got lost in a hurricane. Everybody thought that everybody on board had perished. And like a month or two later, it limps into some harbor miles and miles from where it's supposed to be. Everybody survived. They threw all the horses overboard, but the people survived. And that was the boat that brought my grandmother to America. So there was truth even in that one.
And everybody has these family stories. I'm sure you do too. And part of you wants to investigate, but part of you is afraid of shattering that magic. I know how many people would say, "Oh, my great grandmother was Pawnee," or something like that. Then you all take the 23andMe test, and it's like, oh God, you want some magic and you want some fiction in it. So, how did you decide in any instance in any story not to not to go into it any further because you would burst the magic?
No, because I grew up in such a screwy place that almost all the stories turned out to be true. I mean, you grow up at a hotel in the Borscht Belt. It's like growing up in Vegas. It is nuts. And my father was a real storyteller, and he had his true stories that were really jokes. But then he had his stories, and all about the Jewish mob, Murder Incorporated, and what they were doing in the Catskills. So I have a novel out there called The Bible or Dirty Jokes that's built on his stories. Those all turned out to be true. We would go rowing on Swan Lake, and he'd say, "Oh, it's a little low. The water's a little low this year. The bodies will start showing." There really were bodies in Swan Lake. I can show you the pictures of the mobsters they dragged up from there.
I know you kind of thought, oh, he's a dentist, which wasn't quite,
Right.
exalted enough. But at the same time, he was oracular in these stories. He knew what was there and what was
Yeah.
true.
Yeah.
Um, I want to ask you about the house is it the House of the Dead? The cemetery?
Oh, the House of the World.
The House of the World. Because I know virtually every ancestor of mine for the last 150 years is buried in North Lawn or South Lawn Cemetery in a very small town in Ohio. But in reading yours, I almost started to cry because I thought how many of your forebears are gone up in a smokestack in a concentration camp. And the poignancy, I get moved just thinking about it now, how you, with I think it was your boyfriend at the time,
Marianne, yeah.
went exploring this cemetery, this singular Jewish cemetery.
It's a very strange story. So I was dating a man for a while who's Polish Catholic, but Polish, and his parents escaped the Nazis and the communists, and he was born in a DP camp in Germany. So he's Catholic, but he's very aware of that era of Jewish history, and he lost people in Auschwitz. So he grew up in Detroit, and there was this neighborhood that's now called Pole Town that was settled by Jewish Poles, Catholic Poles, and African Americans. And it was leveled during Coleman Young's mayor term to make way for a Cadillac plant, which was nobody wanted it, and it displaced they just leveled this huge, vibrant neighborhood. The only thing they couldn't level was the Jewish cemetery. So they built a huge automobile factory around the cemetery, and then everybody forgot it was there. And Marion was one of the people who sort of tracked down the history that it was there. And you can go in to see it twice a year, before Passover and before the Jewish holidays in the fall. And it was quite a revelation. The most shocking thing to me is the GM executives, so it's got a wall around it. And the GM executives would spend their lunch hours trying to hit golf balls, get them in the cemetery. So the caretaker had to get all the golf balls out before people came to visit their dead. But it really captured the history of a place. And the question was, why hadn't they been able to move this cemetery? Because they leveled churches, and you actually they said, oh, you can't move the dead. You can move the dead. So it was a way to explore the history of that neighborhood in Detroit, but also this strange relationship between the Polish Catholics and the Jewish Catholics, who had kind of been enemies in the old country and then come over here and settle in the same place, and their relationship to the African Americans in Detroit. So I love getting a story and trying to, figure out what really went on, get to the bottom of it.
And your sense of detail that the paths were wide enough for carriages at the time that the cemetery was put in place. It was very moving. So you're very nimble about moving from emotional stories to comic ones. And when you tell the story about the book of facts about sex education, we all have that moment in our lives when our parents tell us the facts of life, but it's always their version of the facts of life, and it's the version they're comfortable telling in the way they're comfortable telling. And with my mother, she knew I read a lot, because like you write about, when you're stuck in the bathroom, you read all the labels and stuff. And I was stuck in the bathroom without reading material so often that to this day I can recite that Crest can be an effective decay preventive dentifrice that can be of significant value when used in a conscientiously applied program of oral hygiene and regular professional care. So I'm sure you've got one of those too. So so my mother knew I loved to read, learned how to read, so she left me in her bedroom with one of those little booklets and a box of tampons, and that was her idea of sex education. And I figured it out, but your story is so amusing, especially with the one about the hairy sideshow baby. So,
Oh God.
okay.
Well, this book was horrendous. My mother didn't want to have the talk with me, so she kept leaving this book all around the house, and it disappeared from. I mean, it was the illustrations alone were just horrifying, and it was very old-fashioned. It had been written in the, even a long time before I came along. So what was funny though. So I lived all over the planet, and then I was living in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and a student of mine, a graduate student, his wife read my first collection of short stories, The Rabbi in the Attic, and she said to him, "Everything seems so familiar in this book." And turned up she grew up in the house right behind mine in this tiny little town of 5,000 people. And so I go over for dinner, and she hands me this book. And I said, "Oh, that's the book that my mother gave me to teach me about sex." She said, "It's the book." And I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Open it up." I opened it up, and it says, "Wilma Pollack, family, 55, Willie Evan. It was the book. I said it was like being chased by a snarling dog that had been tracking you down for like 50 years. How did you get this? Her boyfriend, her high school boyfriend's mother was my mother's friend. And when the friend's sons reached a certain age, my mother said, "Oh, why don't you give this book to your sons to teach them about sex?" And so it had just been passed around like nobody wanted this thing, but I couldn't get away from it. And so I looked at this and I was like, no wonder I'm screwed up. This book is just, it talks about like you may be born with this disease where you're like the wolf man, but it's okay because you can exhibit yourself in a sideshow and make a lot of money. It was insane.
And this was in the 40s that they were writing
Like
this?
definitely, yeah.
Oh, God, imagine.
It was terrible.
This is P.T. Barnum is the refuge for. You've written 5 novels, and of course, then you've written this wonderful nonfiction and elsewhere. I hate to say what do you like more, because each medium is so different.
Yeah. When I'm writing fiction, I like nonfiction better. When I'm writing nonfiction, I wish I could be making it up.
Because you're thinking, oh, it'd be so much easier if I were,
Yeah, for sure. I kind of like the interface between them. So my fiction tends to be very autobiographical, and my nonfiction, I like to use the element. I don't make anything up, but I like to use the elements of fiction writing to tell it as a story and have characters, and the setting is important. I'm really interested in the intersection between sort of our little lives and where they connect to these bigger historical cultural moments. So like, what's my connection to the Shah of Iran? What's my connection to this neighborhood in Detroit being leveled, and, different movements, socialism or, the labor movement, and obviously the big one is the women's movement. So a lot of what I've written is about, I was born into a society where the definition of being a woman was changing. It stayed the same for thousands of years, and all of a sudden you're born and it's like completely different. And we grew up with this changing definition of what it meant to be a woman. Well, that really affected my life. It affected your lives. what was that about? How did we change? Was it for the better? Was it for the worse? Were the men changing? What was going on? And how did that intersect with my little story? I mean, one thing, these mics, right? I can never remember. They're made for men. I always forget to wear a suit.
They're
There's
always made
nowhere
for men's
unless
inside pockets.
if you don't have a pocket, you're screwed. And I had to walk in carrying this, and I can't ever remember. And I had to take my earrings out because it turns out you can't wear earrings with this. Well, who is this all designed for?
Yeah.
All right. Let's change the technology,
Yeah.
guys.
Or even look at the paving in a mall where your heels will sink into, in between the tiles and think, who thought of this?
Yeah.
Well, we know the answer. There, you do take your daily events, the normal events in the course of your life, and do kind of elevate them into a universal. And I love the story about when you were working at Howard Johnson's, and then the epilogue where you go back and try to find the women that you knew there.
Yeah. I write from a question, right? And when I teach my students, I say that's what you don't want to write what you already know or what you think you know. What fun is that, right? What do you have questions about? Look back at your life. Think about a time in your life. What do you still not understand about that moment and what was going on? Can you, now that you're older and have some distance on it, you can talk to other people, you can read things, can you try to understand, can you try to answer that question? So, I went to work at Howard Johnson's. What was I trying to prove? I got accused of burning down the Howard Johnsons. Why was I, so proud to be? I mean, and what happened to the other girls that I was working there with, and I was trying to get them to respect me. I was the nerd. I was the class brain. They bullied me. I was not seen as knowing how to live in the real world, and so I wanted to prove to them that I was one of them. And it was a nightmare, but it was also wonderful. And then the place burned. I mean, so it's always out of a question. I'm going back, even if it happened 5 minutes ago. And was that story about the Shah of Iran true? Why did that book about sex ed disturb me so much? There's just so much in our lives. My students say, "Well, I don't have any questions," and I'm like, "No." 500 questions go through your mind in any given day. You just have not been taught that they're important. You think, if I don't know this, it must be because I'm stupid or uneducated or I haven't paid attention. If this were a good question, somebody else would be asking it. Who am I to try to answer it? You're not trained to catch it by the tail and then say, I have the power to try to figure this out. And we all do. And I have loved teaching, especially nonfiction, because everybody has questions. And when you empower people to hold on to them, to think they're important, and to think they're capable of answering them, even if it's a family story, why were my grandparents the way they were? It's a wonderful thing.
And then the other side of it is you ask the question and you don't care what the answer is because you want to make up your own.
Well, that's the fiction.
That's the fiction side, right. So, well, speaking of questions, anybody got one? If I'd like you to stand up and I'll repeat the question so we can get it on tape. Oh, my goodness. See? Yes, please. Can you stand up so we can...
When you write about your looking back and understanding your womanness, whatever, you have to be at least 60 to have something useful?
Okay, so the question is, when you look back on your womanness, your state of being a woman, do you think you have to reach the age of, say, 60 or something like that to make it useful, to make it substantive?
Definitely not. I mean, like I said, at 11, I already thought I was old enough to be making meaning out of my life. I think at any age, we have the power to do that. Again, we're just not, when you're in school, the teacher gives you the question and says, write an essay on it. I have never done that with my students. I'm saying, okay, I assign this story or we're doing this topic. What is your question about what we just did in class? And they think that they have a question. I said, not a question because you weren't paying attention or you didn't read the assignment, but you read it and there's something bugging you that you don't get. write your essay trying to answer your own question, right? And they're like, oh, my questions are, no, your question's a good question, right? And especially if it's about your own life or your family or stuff you've been through or you know, who's better able to answer that question at whatever age? I think you need a little distance, right? And just but that distance can be, the next day, right? Or it could be 5 years later. But it's certainly, I mean, I've been writing these essays for years and years and years, but I usually write about something that happened, earlier.
And
You need a little perspective on it.
and just the exercise of writing. You don't need to think this isn't good enough for the New Yorker, so I'm never going to write anything
Right,
again.
no, there are all different reasons we write. In fact, the last essay in the book, I wrote the essay almost simultaneously with the experience. So I have been told in my life that I have the worst singing voice known to humankind. I was told just move your lips and everything. But everybody, I wanted to sing one song before I left the planet. It seemed so much fun to sing, So there was this course offered at the 92nd Street Y in New York City, expressly for people who've been told you cannot sing, just move your lips. And my question was, can they teach even someone like me to sing? And so I took the course and I wrote the essay, really just right after it. So any experience you have, you can, but the point of writing nonfiction especially isn't to write what happened, right? You have to make something more universal of it. So your question about what happened, right? What don't I get about this? What is there about this that's interesting, right? That you have to make something of it. But you can do that the next day, right? You don't have to wait till you're as ancient as I am.
Somebody else? I see tentative hands out there. No, so
Anything's fair game.
yes. Let me repeat the question once you've said it.
I was going to say, because you're a scientist, I don't know what you think about the current book that's kind of fun, Lessons in Chemistry.
So let me repeat the question, which is what you think of a current book called Lessons in Chemistry.
How many of you have, it's a very popular book, yes. So everybody has recommended this to me, my sister, my best friend, and it's a book about a woman who was very smart, wants to be a chemist, and is sexually assaulted and has all this awful stuff to it. It's very comic. I thought I was going to love
Wait,
it.
you said it's very comic?
Yeah, well, that's kind of what I had a problem with.
Okay.
So I write dark comedy too. But having lived through it, it was such a cartoony version of what I had experienced and what I knew so many women had experienced that I kept pulling back from it. I did finish it because I wanted to know what happened, but and it's really churlish of me to say it was unrealistic because I write books that are like totally gonzo, and I get if people say, well, that's not realistic. I'm like, it's fiction. I just couldn't. I couldn't do it. And the little girl, her daughter, was like, I couldn't believe any of it, even at the level of comedy or satire. And because I had lived through it, I wanted it to be more realistic. On the other hand, I love that there's a book about a woman chemist that has become so popular that's made people say it's terrible how women in science got treated or are still being treated. Did you like?
I had the same feeling you did. I mean, the little girl was way beyond her years. But I kept thinking, and I'm not a fiction reader particularly, so I really get it. That can't be possible. This isn't going to work. She's too pretty. But I actually kind of enjoyed it at the end. When it closed, I said, okay, I get what it's about. It's taught us a little bit about chemistry that we might not have already known. I mean, there's
Yeah.
Yeah.
so in the end,
Yeah.
If
Well,
I can make
yes.
the best science book I think I've read in the last 10 years, and I think it's going to have very enduring powers, is by a woman named Rebecca Skloot. It's called The Immortal Life of
Yes.
Henrietta Lacks.
It's a wonderful book.
And a lot of you have read it, and it's just, if there's one nonfiction book about science I recommend, it's that, because it's about the scientific methods, it's about the human condition, about some of the arrogance and the macho found
Yeah.
in science. It's just
I
extraordinary.
also was upset that the woman in the book doesn't end up a chemist. She ends up teaching a cooking show, which, even though she infuses chemistry into it, is just going back to, she doesn't end up a chemist. And
Well,
so I've
I
written a number of books about characters who actually who are women scientists, and I love to see that character in fiction because it's still so rare.
so unfortunately endings come, and this one has. But thank you all for being here, and please
Wonderful
thank
audience. Thank you
Eileen
so
Pollack.
much.